And I want to thank my panelists for being here. Some of them I've known for years, and they always come to these events, and others I have just met. So Helena Morrissey is here from London. She's CEO of Newton Asset Management, and she's one of the founders of the 30% Club, which is 30% women on boards in the UK by 2015. And I'd like to also introduce Mary Gowdy, who's not on the panel, but would you stand up, Mary? She's with the House of Lords, but she's worked very closely with Helena in terms of making this happen in the UK, and we're going to be hearing about that. Helena is also a twice winner of Investment Week's Global Bond Fund Manager of the Year and named the Financial News Most Influential Women in European Asset Management in 2010. Dina Dublon. Dina Dublon I have known for so many years when she was CFO of JP Morgan Chase, and I saw Dina really reach into the organization and pull women up. And when Bill Harrison at the time, and he was CEO, didn't know women, she said, "You will." And these women were just outstanding. They got promoted. She is a senior lecturer at Harvard Business School and board director of Microsoft, Accenture, and Pepsico. Charlynn Goins, also known you for 20 years, I think, Charlynn. Chairman of the New York Community Trust Board, and currently a Fannie Mae board, and former director of AXA Financial. Bill McCracken, I see you in the corner there. Bill is former CEO, board chair, and chairman of CA, former director of Icon Office Solutions, and named by the National Association of Corporate Directors as one of the top most influential people in the boardroom. And you're leading a commission on board diversity called the Blue Ribbon Commission for the NACD. Glenn Hubbard, so happy to have you here. Dean of the Columbia Business School, board director of ADP, BlackRock Closed-End Funds, KKR Financial, and MetLife. And thanks to Lulu Wang and Kathy Kenny, he is here with us today. He is also the author of Aid Trap, Hard Truths About Ending Poverty, and Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise, 5 Steps to a Better Healthcare System. And he was also Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Treasury for Tax Policy. But all of these bios are in your handouts, and they are very long because these are highly accomplished people, and I thank them all for being here. Now, there are a number of efforts underway, and some you're going to hear about today, about getting more women on boards. And there's an organization called the Women's Forum of New York, which is part of an international women's forum. And we started in 2011 a corporate board initiative. And there are 2 aspects to this. One is the Breakfast of Corporate Champions, which we held November 2nd, 2011, and we're going to hold it November 21st, 2013, again, to honor companies that have at least 20% women on their boards. And this is national. It's not just the tri-state area. When we did it the first time, it was just tri-state companies, Fortune 1000. Now we are going to the Fortune 500, and we will have a panel of CEOs. And I'm going to show you a clip about what the Breakfast of Corporate Champions is all about, because it's part of this broader corporate initiative, but it's also to get CEOs to sponsor women for boards. If a woman is sponsored by a CEO or a board chair, she has a far greater chance of getting on a board, because if you're looking for a board member and you know that Terry Lundgren of Macy's has endorsed somebody, or Ken Chenault of American Express, you're going to take a look at that individual. And as search consultants, I want you to know that this database exists. At the Women's Forum of New York, there are 100 names in that database. These are all board-ready women who CEOs have sponsored. It's free of charge. You don't have to pay for it. So I urge you to use it, and there'll be more information coming out to you after the conference about how to access the Women's Forum. But without further ado, I want to just show a 3-minute clip of what the Breakfast of Corporate Champions is about, which is part of the corporate board initiative that the Women's Forum has launched. Right? The Women's Forum started the corporate board initiative to raise the profile of women in the corporate world, to put more women on boards. And so what we did was launch the Breakfast of Corporate Champions to honor those companies that had at least 20% women on their boards. They sent their directors, they sent their CEOs, and that is really the tone that we wanted. We wanted men and women in the room who were really the decision makers. With power comes responsibility. These leaders recognize that having women at the highest level, the boardroom, is a strategic business imperative. We are the consumers, the employees, the shareholders. We are in the communities in which these companies operate.
We have to be inclusive of race, of gender, and of cultural diversity, because it is all of those things that make the world what it is today.
From my perspective, the demeanor of the boardroom changes when women join the board. Women listen more. I think they help a board focus more on making the right decision as opposed to being right.
It's very clear that having women makes a huge difference. One is not enough, two's not enough. Society knows that, based on studies, that you have a tipping point almost at about a third.
So companies get it. They want women at the table. And it's been shown that with more women in the C-suite and more women in the boardroom, better company performance.
The company gains so many things by having more women on their boards. They gain the diversity of perspective, they gain the diversity of experience, they gain different work styles, and in addition to that, they gain role models. And I think that's important for the organization, right? Young women, young professionals want to look up and they want to be represented at the top of the organization.
The other part of the initiative is to get CEOs in these companies to sponsor women in their companies for board positions. So what we did at the Breakfast of Corporate Champions in 2011 was to announce our database. It is a unique database. It is a database of board-ready women who were sponsored by CEOs or chairs of boards.
The database of board-ready women is absolutely essential to what's going on. If you look at the activity all around the world, whether it's in other countries, whether it's based on research, what you'll oftentimes hear is that people say there are not enough board-ready women. We know there are, and our database absolutely proves it.
And so at the current rate in the Fortune 500, it'll take us 60 years to get to parity. That's a really long time. So think about it. If you have a 10-year-old daughter, niece, or granddaughter, she's going to be 70 years of age before we get to parity in the boardroom. And I'm going to be 95, still with this charge to make it happen. So with that, I'd like to ask the panelists to please come to the stage, and we'll talk about what are the obstacles, what can we do about it, and what can we learn from our partners across the pond.
I think it's boy, girl, boy, girl.
Boy, girl. Sit.
Okay.
Come over here. Hi there, Charlynn Goins.
Okay, so we have Bill McCracken. I'm sorry, we have Dina Dublon.
Sorry.
Bill McCracken, Charlynn Goins, Bob Kueppers, Helena Morrissey, and Glenn Hubbard. Thank you all for being here. So I didn't get mic, so I'm going to just stand here. So let's look at what are some of the issues that are going on, because we'll move that along. And let's talk about what I said in the video. It's going to take 60 years, really? Can't we do something about that? In the UK, they are. So I would like to start off with Helena Morrissey talking about the 30% Club and the drivers that you have in the UK and what you're doing to make this happen and the progress that you've achieved.
Shall I come stand there? Because then
yes.
I've got those slides. Thank you, Janice. Well, great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for having me along. So in the last couple of years in the UK, there's really been, frankly, an epiphany among British businesses. We were, I think, just like the US, is currently pretty much stuck. We weren't getting anywhere in terms of increasing the proportion of women on boards, and it was still, although there were lots of companies talking about diversity and inclusion initiatives, still seen very much as a sort of, well, an HR point rather than a kind of business point. 3 years ago, almost to the day, Mary and I were talking and had the idea of having an initiative that had a goal. I run a business. We have measurable objectives on just about every criteria. And one of the things I was conscious of, having run the Women's Network initiative for BNY Mellon in EMEA, BNY Mellon owns Newton, was that people were saying how wonderful and inspiring all the events were, but we weren't seeing any change in the numbers. So already we heard the idea that the tipping point might be around a third, came up with 30% as our goal. I firmly am opposed to quotas, and I'm happy to talk about that, but don't want to sort of hijack the whole discussion by getting stuck on that one. And then realised as well that the bit that was missing was the support of business leaders. Chairman in British businesses, obviously we separate out the role of CEO and chairman. And the chairman has the board and therefore has the power to put on the board who he or sometimes she deems fit. And so we enlisted the support of chairmen of British businesses. And we now have over 60 chairmen, around half of FTSE companies, the other half a mix of professional services firms and smaller 250 companies. And the pace of change has rapidly quickened in the last couple of years. Obviously, subsequent to our launch, which was in November 2010, Lord Davis came out with a blueprint for change in the UK, and our timing was lucky. Because by the time he came out, we had 24 supporters and a sort of voice. People were surprised, great support from the media, about how much appetite there was for change. And this chart just shows, you know, I'm not sure if you can read it from the back, but basically that the line ticked up quite considerably since then. It's actually somewhat stalled. Data yesterday released showed that we haven't made progress since last November. And that doesn't really surprise me because I think a lot of companies have been there, done that once they've appointed one woman to the board. But it has been, for most of last year, we're running at about half of the appointments for non-exec directors going to women in the FTSE. And we've seen, let's see what we've got now, great support from the executive search firms, who I must admit were somewhat wary. I had some rather sort of prickly kind of calls with some of the leading board practices right at the start of all this, because I think they thought it was interference with what was already well established in terms of how they put board candidates forward, but also I think they felt genuinely that there wasn't much appetite among the chairman or the chairman of nomination committees. And of course, by signalling their support through joining the 30% Club, the chairman were able to show that actually they're the ones that want change. And now 41 members of the search firm community have signed up to the voluntary code that followed Lord Davis' recommendation for at least 30% women on the long list for board positions. I think there's somewhere in the room, there's some booklets that people can take later, which go into a little bit more depth of all of this, but I just want to do the short version so that my other panelists can speak. And that was my pages. But what we've got here now is a real sort of appetite for sustainable, meaningful change. This is not about putting a few token women on the board and then sort of saying job done. We now have much more effort around the executive pipeline. There are still a lot more, there's a lot more to do in terms of developing senior women in business management roles. Within the 30% Club, there's an investor group, 15 firms representing about £2 trillion of assets. Firms like BlackRock, Legal & General, which is the biggest pension fund manager in the UK, and a passive fund manager, so just is going to stick around and get these companies to change, engaging very constructively with UK and global companies on the issue. I'm going to hand over to my moderator again, but all I was going to say is as well that this is going global. So on the 14th of this month, 30% Club launches in Hong Kong. They've got 35 founding chairmen, which is fantastic. And I have broad-based political support for that as well. New Zealand has launched a 25% club. We'll forgive them their lesser ambition. Canada's interested. South Africa are going ahead and launching one. I had an inquiry this morning from Romania, which hadn't been on my top list of countries to conquer. Germany and Netherlands are interested as well. And I am keen to start something in the US. BNY Mellon are going to help, and I'm happy to take any interest in that later on. But I shall now pass over back to Janice.
Thank you, Helena. You know, making tremendous progress over there. 6 percentage points in 18 months, nearly, you know, that's really tremendous. We're here, we're growing at 0.5% a year. So something's wrong with what we're doing in the US. And so I'd like to turn it to our panel and say, what is happening overseas that we might learn from here? Anyone want to start off with that? Dina.
Hi, good afternoon to everybody. I think, let me start by saying, just providing a diverse slate doesn't work. And I would say that often what we might see from executive search firms is, here is the diverse slate, you do the rest. So kind of speaking to you as the people who can press for change, as well as obviously help it happen in other ways, it is engaging with the chairman of nominating and governance, with the CEO, with other people that you're dealing with when you are creating, when you're bringing in new board members, is engaging in that conversation that goes beyond, here is the diverse slate. I do think that the practice of skills matrix is an important practice to continue to have dialogue on between you and the clients. Many companies today do have them. They sometimes have them pro forma, sometimes they have it on a substantive basis. I am a great believer in setting targets and measuring. So in the US, the notion of having a quota, and you said you oppose quota, and I'm fine, we don't need to have a quota, but we do need to have targets and we do need to measure progress. And the reality of it is that if we do want to move beyond the 0.5% a year, as you point out, we need to be doing something that is extraordinary. So having board appointments that are, 10 to 15% of your practice is helping, from all the board placements you have, being women is not enough. So the issue is, how do you get so that if you want to move the needle, it is moving to the 50% needle, place in the clock there, in order to actually affect change in a somewhat more meaningful way. So I don't think there is a silver bullet, but it's going to be a variety of.
Well, now that you brought up targets, so for each of you, on any of the boards you serve or served, have you looked at having targets? When you look at your boardroom, now I'd like to really, everybody take a picture of this panel, because this is a great diverse slate. Right? And this is what we need to do as search consultants, is to present a great diverse slate. But on the boards that you're on or have served on, have you had targets, Glenn?
Not really. We've had discussions of aspirations, much as you described, a formal numerical target. No, in fact, the one where we've least talked about the target is the board I'm on that actually has 1/3 women. So I don't think it's a matter of the word that you use, it's about how you set the aspiration. To my mind, there are two things I think that really help that. One is building on something Bob said about the argument for doing this in the first place. It is now, I think, more understood that diversity is powerful business reasons, but there's recent research, ironically, mainly in the United States, because you were asking about borrowing from wisdom elsewhere, mainly in this country in business schools, showing that the number of female executives and female board members is related, as Bob suggested, to performance metrics, but also to the way in which decisions are made in an organization. So there's the argument point. The other point I think that can complement targets is process, by which I mean not just asking for a diverse slate, but really asking for the very top diversity candidates whenever another choice is made. That simple asking of a question really pivots toward a more diverse slate.
That's great. Anyone else? Bill?
I think I probably mentioned a couple things. On the clips that they showed, one of the things I've mentioned in the past is I think women bring capability to a board that, frankly, men don't. I mentioned I think women listen better. And I guess I would say it a little bit differently, too, and that is that they listen actively. Oftentimes, board members appear to be listening, that what they're really doing is sitting impatiently their opportunity to speak next. I think women, though, do hear what is being said. I think one of the key things, though, that I would shift to, Janice, is there's a leadership gap that I think is developed. And I think one of the places you have to look is at the board chair. I was a board chair. and then I was a CEO as well. And I think that by not being active in pressing diversity on boards, I think board chairs are sending a message. And so I think that's one of the things that does need to be looked at and does need to be talked about, number one. Number two, you as search firms, I think, need to be more active as well. I, as board chair, went after board candidates. The very first person I brought on the board was a woman. But I can tell you that for all the contacts that I've made, I don't think the initial candidates that I got from any search firm where the man was interfacing with me were women. Women more often in search firms brought women candidates forward. And so I think that you also need to be active in trying to help us work on the issue that we're talking about here.
Charlynn, do you want to add to that?
Yes, I'd like to add something. I agree with Bill completely that the board chair is the person from whom the tone is set for everything else within the entire company. And I don't mean just bringing in other directors who are either female or people of color. I think that when the board chair and hopefully other directors are a diverse group, it impacts tremendously senior management, the rank and file, and the people and companies with whom your company deals. It really is amazing. I am an African-American woman on boards, and we are few and far between, I might add, but I can tell you that I've had people come up to me from within companies where I've served on the board and told me how good it made them feel and how much they felt that the company had a view that inclusiveness and diversity was important because I was a member of that board. Mm-hmm. So I think that it does start with the board chair. It also starts with the nominating committee chairman. I serve as nominating committee chairman at Fannie Mae, and I chaired the search committee for our new CEO last year. And it really is important when working with search firms to let them know that you don't want just window dressing when it comes to your slate that they bring to you. In other words, they all bring a diverse slate because certainly dealing with an African-American nominating chairman, they're going to do that. But if it's just window dressing and not real value-added candidates, it's not useful. And there are candidates out there, if you look for them, that are people who will meet all the criteria you're looking for.
Right. Bob?
Just to level set this a little bit, today is, we just published a study on gender diversity in the boardroom. I don't even have it yet. I mean, it's only in a PDF. We'll make sure everybody gets a copy one way or the other through the distribution. But it's global in the sense that on one end, you've got Japan at 1%, and in the middle, you've got, you know, US, UK, parts of Western Europe in the teens, but the leaders are the Nordics. Finland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway are 25 and more. Partly, everyone knows that Norway has sort of this quota idea now, but the Nordic countries are well ahead of everybody else, and it goes everywhere around the world from there. So it's just, you know, the averages don't mean much because it's from here to there.
So, but what is the problem? What are the obstacles? I mean, these boards you're on, you know, this great representation of women, but you talk with your colleagues. What's holding women back from getting into the boardroom? We have the UK with 30% by 2015. The Women's Forum is honoring companies with 20% or more. You know, you see all of these reports about greater company performance with more women on the board. I mean, it's black and white. Why aren't we making more inroads?
I think sometimes boards aren't really looking at the skill sets. The discussion already came up before about the desire for CEOs. If you set your goal as a current CEO or even a recently retired CEO, that's overwhelmingly likely to be a man. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the skill set matrix on many boards, there's industry knowledge, sector knowledge, that it's not necessarily the case that a current CEO has any monopoly on that relative to somebody else. Some of the most effective women directors I have known on boards have not been CEOs, but have enormous functional expertise in what the company is trying to do. So I think the more we adhere to really asking the question, what skills do we want, as opposed to what job title did that person have, we can move it along a lot faster.
Perhaps I could comment there, because I think that has been one of the reasons behind the change of pace. I mean, still we've got a lot to go in terms of the absolute numbers. But there's an iterative sort of dialogue, it appears, between now the chairman or the chairman of the nomination committees and the search firms, much more about sort of around the language of building a team on a board. And again, that's a really big change from people, you know, putting the great and the good on and having a very sort of, you know, narrow definition of an appropriate board candidate. And somebody actually who is a chairman of a company, not 30% Club supporter particularly, but someone I know said actually what had happened through the 30% Club work was actually he felt that the lid had been prized open on the search process for board directors way beyond gender. I mean, for me, gender is just like the start of shaking up the boardroom. And in the UK, I think a little bit more than in the US, there's been more of a realization that the status quo was not acceptable anymore following the financial crisis. And we have the slight advantage that there are sort of the good corporate governance, very clear framework. I don't mean relative to the US, it has a good corporate governance, but we have a good corporate governance framework. And that includes the best practice of 2 fixed terms of 3 years maximum for directors. So the natural inbuilt turnover there. So people have to keep thinking, who do I want on my board? And I've been just impressed by how the search community has responded to that, and say from being somewhat skeptical and nervous about what all this meant to now engaging and helping. One of the things that they tell me they're doing often is helping the chairman socialize a diverse candidate with the rest of the board who maybe is slightly more turkeys voting for, I would say Christmas, but you might say Thanksgiving. You know, that it's kind of like they don't really see change as a good thing. So, yeah.
I'd like to pick up on one of the comments that Glenn made. And, you know, we talk about qualifications. And, you know, I was board chair before I became CEO, and I resigned the chair position when I became CEO, because that's another thing I feel strong about. I think those roles should be split. They're different jobs. But picking up on the qualification piece, you know, CEOs would just naturally, you've got all kinds of people coming at you all the time. I mean, everywhere you look, there's somebody at you. Customers, analysts, shareholders, boards, employees. So you try to make your life a bit more comfortable. And so you say to a board chair, get somebody that's sat in my chair so they understand where I am. And somebody that hasn't will ask a question. You say, why did they ask that question? And then I go out and talk with some of my owners, and they ask the same question. So the point is, some of the things that you want probably deny you getting an understanding from a better, more full point of view, where somebody asks a question that you stop thinking about, but the people that are going to invest in you are asking those same very same questions. And so I think sometimes we overemphasize what the qualifications need to be with respect to it needs to match up so that the CEO feels comfortable.
Anyone else?
So let me just take that a step further. So there are a tremendous number of what I would suggest are qualified women for board spots. But the problem everyone has is getting on your first board. And would you, as search people, even think about putting a woman forward? I met a woman a couple months ago. I've been trying to help her get on boards. She ran a $2 billion division of one of these huge companies in 3 different continents, and she had full P&L responsibility, thousands of people. So she's actually a CEO in her own right, but she never had that title. She's never been on a board, but she's smart as can be. So the question is, how do people get on their first board? And I just think there's a whole, I don't know what the right word is, but just a tremendous talent pool that doesn't get tapped into because they're not sitting on boards today, which is frankly is why I like the database point with board ready with some endorsement, because I can't believe these people aren't in demand given what we've been discussing.
That's right. And so that raises the issue about, you know, and I've had this too, I just can't find a great woman for my board. She doesn't have the experience, the qualifications. You know, what's your experience with that in terms of using search firms, looking into the marketplace, and that pipeline? Is it a pipeline issue? Is it a perception issue? Are we going to the wrong pools?
I think it's nonsense, actually. I don't even think it's a pipeline issue. There are plenty of board-ready women out there. On the board searches I've done that have led to female candidates, to be candid, I say this quietly, I guess in a room like this, it wasn't really from the search firm. It was really from the directors themselves and the CEO in some cases identifying candidates out there. And so the people are there, and you know, at least several of the times we're taking a risk on somebody serving for the first time. But to your point, if there's a certification, if you will, from another executive, from a CEO, from other board members, that really helps. But I don't think it's a pipeline problem.
So the talent is out there.
I think the talent's there.
Even for the large industrial companies.
Even for the large industrial companies.
Okay.
One of the things you just said then, Glenn, was about the risk of putting someone on the board for the first time. And I think that's, again, something that just has happened in the UK, that people have realised that it might be more of a risk not having a woman on the board than having somebody who hadn't served for it. It's a kind of like a balancing act to those two risks. I was amazed in 2011, just about 2/3 of the almost 100, it was like 99 women appointed to boards, were newbies. Which was staggering to me, and it made me realise that there had been a sort of pivotal shift, that people were saying, I've just got to get a woman on the board, hopefully the right one, but if they haven't served on a board before, I mean, I talked to, I'm sure it won't mind me telling the story, chairman of Accenture, Sir Roger Carr, who has been a great supporter of all this. He had 2 board vacancies, he said, I'm going to put a classic standard, you know, man probably candidate in one, and because I know who that will see, and then I'll say to the rest of the board, let's get somebody who hasn't got board experience already and diversify just in terms of their experience set as well as the gender. And that's what he did, and that should have set a bit of a precedent, and people thought, and she's done a great job on the board. So.
You know, I think the Spencer Stuart survey, anybody here from Spencer Stuart? Yeah, I think your survey says that the first-time board directors in this one, I know the one in 2011 was 21%. I think this year it's 30% of first-time board directors. So the percentage is going up. That's good. But the percentage for women has not gone up that much. I think it's still about 25% of new board directors. And the number of board seats opening up, it was like less than 300 last year. So that number is going down. Retirement ages are going up. People don't want to leave their boards, and we don't have term limits on a lot of boards, and some don't have retirement ages. But I think the first-time board directors, there is more of an acceptance if the person is qualified to bring them on. So that's the good news, but there are all these obstacles. So when you approach the search for somebody coming onto one of your boards, and you talk to your colleagues about this, are you doing things differently? Are you using search firms? Are you using your own pool from people you know and tapping into your board directors? How do you go about finding great board directors?
Well, I can lead off with that because I've done quite a bit in that area over the last few years. We do use search firms because we want a broad range of candidates, and we can't know everybody, certainly not since we're a small board, but we often have names that we will add to the list that the search firm brings to us, where we either know a person or know of someone that we would like to consider, so that it does broaden the spectrum a bit. And I think that going back to what Glenn said earlier about it being, this pipeline story being somewhat nonsense, I think that Lee Ellis's comment about helping people to confront, confront their fears and concerns, their doubts and fears. People like to hire and bring people on in their own image, and to get them to move beyond that, whether it's for women, people of color, anything different, people who haven't had board experience, it brings up their fears and their doubts. And I think that one of the things search firms can do is try to help the nominating chairman, committee chairman, or the committee, or the board, or the board chair to move beyond that.
Any other comments?
I couldn't agree more. I think that there are two things. One is a sponsor, somebody on the board who's an advocate, but the other is to have the candidate be highly networked, not necessarily with the people in the room, but in the corporate world.
Do you know, one of the things that happens as a shareholder, I read the proxy. And I look at people who have been on a board for 15 or 20 years. And then I look at some of the ages. And I have no problem with age. I'm getting there myself. But you know, the fact is, maybe people have been on the board too long. Maybe they become a little complacent on the board. How do you refresh a board today? Because I know there's only about 20 to 25% of the boards do individual performance evaluations. They do board evaluations, right, Bob?
Right.
But they don't do a lot of individuals on the board. So it's hard to refresh a board. What's been your experience with that?
I mean, there is no replacement to refreshment by new people, right? None of the boards I sit on have term limits. Corporates, the non-for-profits do have term limits. Yes. But the corporates, none of them. In fact, one of them started with term limits and kind of dropped it once it became very close to happening. I would say it's a good practice. I have been advocating inside my own boards to adopt it. It is particularly difficult in situations in which some members have been there for a long time, and there is this great apprehension that it is going to be viewed as an attempt to personally get them off the board. That's not the issue. So it becomes more sensitive, if you have a board that none of them have passed the, 15, 20 years, pick your time frame, the UK is obviously quite a bit shorter than that. But then you're not personally attacking anybody, but you always have. And unless that person is somebody that you have co-opted into the idea to be kind of the one putting it forth, it becomes a very sensitive issue. So my way of going about it is actually going to attempting to go to the most senior members, senior in terms of how long they have been on the board, and trying to engage in a conversation for them to lead. Right. As opposed to it being viewed as.
So you're an active voice. You're an active voice doing this.
So I do think term limits is an important element in this whole kind of wave of change. It's not the only tool, but it's an important tool that I think is better governance anyway. I am less clear on what is the right term limits. We started with a notion of 9 years, and I kind of said, no, maybe it's 12 years. I don't know. So it's not like I have a science around what is the right term, but I do think the notion of having people rotate off after some long period of time is a good practice.
Yeah, I think it comes down to, again, looking at the skill sets you need, because it's hard to say what the right term is. I actually think many directors have been on a long time. We're still independent. My concern isn't that. It's that for most companies, what they do and the businesses that they're in changes so much over a period of time that constantly looking at what's the skill set we need. Do we have men and women who know a lot about X or Y or Z? If you force yourself to have that conversation, then it becomes a little natural as you look around the table. We're long here, we're short here. That may be a sort of gentler way to force it.
I think a couple things help in terms of this turnover point. One, if you do have an independent chair, it takes some of the pressure off the CEO. If it's the old model where your chair CEO is the same person and a lot of these people were invited onto this board by that individual, it gets very difficult to figure out what's transpired that you need to make the change. I think as companies evolve and they develop new strategies, at some point, the people from 1972 is a completely different company at this point, right? And I also think annual elections of directors help a lot because you don't have to wait for a 3-year term to expire. Now we're basically everyone's up every year for most companies. I just think it's a little bit easier, but it really comes down to whether or not the contribution remains constant when a company evolves, because at some point, you know, you almost naturally separate from whatever the strategy is.
So so you have some of the best search professionals here. They work with C-suite, board directors, and filling those board seats. What's your advice to them in terms of, and to all of us, what can we do better?
I'll pick, just
Okay,
to
we'll
start
go
the
right down.
conversation, not for any other reason. But I do think it gives you an opportunity to engage with the person that you're engaging with and to show off by bringing an unusual name. So kind of understanding the industry, understanding some of the company needs, and actually going for the unusual name, I think that's an opportunity to be different to the person that has to be fulfilling that role. So that's one. There are probably many, many others, but that's one way in which you can differentiate yourself as opposed to kind of just have the, quote, normal candidate slate. I will stop here. There will be others.
We'll go right to Bill. We'll just go right down to the panel.
I think one of the key things that you can do is, as you do understand the company you're dealing with, understand the culture, understand their strategy, understand what they're trying to do at this time in their life, and then don't be afraid to press for the candidates that you think are the appropriate people for them. You know, don't be reluctant because, you know, if you press your candidate and they don't choose it, it puts you in bad stead, maybe. But I guess it goes back to the lunchtime speaker. You do your work well, you understand your job well, you do your homework, you prepare, take a position. You really have no benefit if you don't press a position. You just sort of are handing over some names that we might look at and then choose from. So I think you can have a leadership role in it as well too. And if you have a strong feel about a candidate, push them.
Charlynn.
What I'll say is not very different from what Dina and Bill said, but I think that search firms can make a better effort to educate their clients, not in a teaching sort of finger wagging way, but letting them know some of the data that Bob has given to you and others have given to you about how important it is for the company itself to have a diverse board, adding women to the board. And if you can present yourself as giving them some new information about that, and then present them with the unusual candidate that Dina has just referred to, I think you are really being a value added, which could make it a better business opportunity for you with that firm in the future.
You know, I'll just repeat a couple things I said at the front end. You know, open the aperture for who you would consider as a viable candidate for a slate, including people that are board ready but not board experienced. I also think that purchase order conversation at the front end is really important. When you ask, did nominating governments consider the attributes of this candidate other than they're looking for an industry expert or other than, you know, and sometimes the answer is, well, we really didn't spend a lot of time on that. That's an opportunity to say, well, let me tell you what I'm seeing in the marketplace. A lot of my clients are this, a lot of my clients are that. They're paying close attention to the makeup of their board, you know, more broadly than just the one or two criteria that you've given me. And that is exactly that, a chance to, you know, we want you to be at the market. We don't want you to be behind the curve. And because I do this for a living, I can tell you there are some ideas you should consider. I think that would be helpful.
As well as echo all of the above, I would also add that I've certainly had feedback from headhunters in the UK that sometimes the women candidates, when they've got to that shortlist position or long list, haven't interviewed well, haven't known how to sell themselves well, even if they're very senior in what they're doing. And although it sounds a little bit condescending, and I don't mean it as such, they've realized that I would suggest, and on the basis of what they fed back, that actually they need to, you know, say, tell me your sales pitch, you know, tell me why you're going to be great on the board, and kind of just because women we're not so great about, you know, saying all the things we're good at. We kind of say, oh, this is a bit of area of weakness and so forth. And I know that's a crass generalization, but, you know, the feedback has been that they put forward women candidates, and then they kind of, even though they might have achieved a huge amount in their professional life, when they get in front of that panel or they have the interview, they just don't quite know how to conduct, especially if they're new to it, the interview and really put the best foot forward. So I would try and take a little bit of extra help to kind of get the women over that hurdle.
You know, let me just add something to that, because Bill made a comment one time at one of the sessions we were at that women also have to put themselves in the network. And you hired put on one of your board directors, a woman, because you met her at a luncheon. Mm-hmm. So you have to be in the right company, you have to network with the men in order to, and then present yourself. But that was a very natural conversation you had, and all of a sudden Bill turns around and says, this woman has to be on my board. Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with what everyone has said, and just add one thing to widen the pool to really include experts. So for example, if I were a pharmaceutical company heavily in R&D, a university president who is a scientist certainly seems perfectly reasonable, even though she or he doesn't meet the executive test. There are a lot of board needs that really are about expertise in an area. Financial expertise on that side of a company, or the product expertise, and that widens the pool substantially to other professionals even outside the direct business world.
Because the companies are changing, aren't they? And now digital expertise is becoming very important. So let me stop for a moment and open it for questions that you will have of the panel. Peter.
When I was recruiting, and even today, I get approached by people who are still recruiting. I mean, I cannot think of one example where a senior woman has come and said, I'm thinking about my next step and I'd like to get on a board. They're all men. And men assume that as part of their career, they will be entitled to get on a board. So part of what we do in the search business is say, well, you know, it's not quite as easy as you might think. But there are no women, in my experience, coming forward and saying, I want to be on a board. So is it not, part of the problem is we're talking about the pull, but what about the push?
Well, I'm going to speak from my experience. I have a lot of women who come to me, a lot of women who are trying to get into the boardroom, and it's very hard for them because they're maybe not in the network with men. And so a lot of these women, I've said, if you're in your C-suite or you've worked with a chair of a board or a CEO, get him to sponsor you and get into the Women's Forum database. It's a national, international database. And you don't have to be a member of the Women's Forum. You don't have to even work for that CEO or that chair, but he knows you. He's seen you in the C-suite. And so I turn them that way because I may not have a search for them. But I will tell you that there are a lot of women out there. And when the New York Stock Exchange did Moving the Needle, the women and minority men were lined up, and they were sponsored by a lot of CEOs to be part of a board. So there are a lot of board-ready women out there that are there. They may not have come to you then, but I think it's also risen up because of the quotas overseas, and women are saying, I do want to get on a board. And actually overseas is coming to the US to pick out some of our women. But do you have a comment on that?
I could add to that in response to your comment. I do tell women who have said to me, how do you get on a board, or how did you get on a board? I have told them to not be shy, and when they are out and about meeting people and talking to people that they know, they have to network just like the old boys network used to be, and they need to step up to the plate and say, I'd like to be on a board. If you have any thoughts on that, please let me know. And I really think that they do have to do that in addition to doing what Janice has suggested.
But to Peter's point, you know, I do think men assume they have the right and will get there.
Yes.
Women haven't done that as well to market themselves. So I agree with you. Yes.
Dina and Charlynn, tell us how you cracked the code and got on your first board. Who took the leap with you for your first corporate board? Thank you.
My first corporate board was a small new board that was being created when a bank was being purchased up in Connecticut. And I had worked with the person who was going to be the CEO of the bank as a consultant for the Department of Commerce for a couple of years, just in a part-time consulting role. And so he asked me to be on the board, and he didn't seem to be worried. It was a new small board, and that helped me to get on to that first one. And then the second board that I joined, the second corporate board, was through a friend who had been on another board related to that company and had recommended me. I have to say that I have never been recommended by a search firm. It has always been through my own networking, so that's why I responded to Peter in the way that I did.
Amazing.
Well, I think mine is a more traditional role. I was named the CFO of, at that point, JP Morgan. Actually, at that point it was Chase, not JP Morgan Chase. So that's a public visible, you know, it's a visible position. And I got approached, was it an executive search firm? It might have been an executive search firm. It might have been directly the CEO. I don't remember. It would have been maybe early '99. So I was approached to join. It was the Hartford Financial Group. I remember going to talk to my CEO at the time about whether it's the right thing to do, to consider. I thought that, you know, given my increased interactions with our own board, that it would be a good learning development experience for me. And he had a little bit of an attitude of, is that a prestigious enough company for you to join the board? And I said, well, I don't know, but if you can help in any other way, I welcome, which was the end of the conversation. So I did join the Hartford Financial Group. And, you know, it did create, once that door opened, and again, I was in a visible CFO position, and at some point in time, financial experts became a desired and actually necessary quality around the board table.
Definitely.
Okay. I had right back here with the mic.
Thought it might be useful to highlight a program we have in Canada, just to tuck away for your own interest.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a joint venture on the part of Korn Ferry in Canada, a governance expert called Patrick O'Callaghan. And the program is called Women on Board. And the centerpiece of this program is a mentor-mentee relationship. And so we have a cohort of about 15 women, small, of course, this is Canada, not the US, but a cohort of 15 women enter the program each year for a 2-year program with quarterly meetings and ongoing coaching by the mentor of the mentee. What we've discovered, I sit on the advisory board of directors of the program, what we have learned over this past 6 years is the importance of the caliber of the mentor and the mentee. It's a bit like professors and students. You want to have the highest caliber professors in a university so you attract the best students. And similarly, we need to ensure that we have the best caliber women to attract the mentors. And we've had some considerable success. Our percentage of women on boards is dismal in Canada, and similarly it's better in the US than in Canada, but the US has been used to quota systems and so has a bit of an impetus. Nothing like Europe, of course, where they brought in legislation to mandate women on boards. But we're finding that a program of this nature has worked very well. And so the Korn Ferry role in this is to identify mentors and mentees in order to create success all around. And it seems to be a really good program.
Thank you very much. That's great. Did you have a question over here? Yeah.
Helena, really inspired by the impact you've had in the UK. I'm on the global board of the AESC, and I've been surprised and disappointed by the response of a number of our member firms to the possibility of a code, an international code that speaks to a target around diversity on slates, gender included. Can you speak to the consequence of the industry, and we've got obviously many of the luminaries of the industry here today, the consequences of the industry not being bold and courageous and accepting that targets should be part of the thinking to drive forward this change?
Well, I am conscious that there are obviously cultural, local issues, or differences at least. Certainly in the UK, the consequence would have been if a search community, along with other parts of the puzzle, hadn't done their bit, the threat of mandatory quotas. And in Europe, although there's legislation going through its much watered down version of the original, and that was partly because there was so much pushback, including obviously from a number of countries where they've seen voluntary change. So I think ultimately there is a risk, obviously, of legislation and people. But I think actually there is what surprises me, and a point I didn't make earlier, was that there would be any reluctance in the sense that this has seemed to, and this has created a business opportunity for quite a few of the search firms. You mentioned Korn Ferry in Canada. There have been several in the UK who've really stolen a march on their competitors and are now getting more board appointment positions or mandates because they're ahead of the game. So I think in a way, you know, I appreciate that people sort of feel that they don't want to kind of always welcome change, that change is uncomfortable. But I think this is the zeitgeist. This is what you know, investors ultimately, whether it's through pressure, and it seems a more militant issue in the US, perhaps because there isn't such an established corporate governance code already, in the way that we have it in the UK, which sort of has led to the separation of CEO and chairman and all those other things as well. But I do think that, you know, there's a realization in the UK that this way actually has enabled people to develop another new relationship with the boards that they're working for, and to stay current and moving ahead with all sorts of aspects of how a board is shaped. So in a way, I think you're kind of missing an opportunity. There may not be an obvious sort of immediate cost if you haven't got pressure for legislation here.
Okay, I'm being asked to wrap it up. Thank you for that question. That's great. And one more question? Yes, sir.
There are groups like NACD and others out there that are doing a really great job on education for board members, but how valued on the inside is the education, the training, the certification that comes from an NACD, or is that really not as valued in the bottom line decision or even identifying folks through that database?
Well, I'm on the board of NACD, so I could probably comment some. Over the last several years, the amount of the education that corporations have taken part in has been substantially increasing, double-digit increases each year. And in Fortune 50 companies as well, probably most importantly. And the consulting with respect to boards and board skills and talents is something that boards do appear now to be valuing from an education point of view. And we just went through our business plan at the last meeting, and our expectation for this year is a substantial increase again in it. So I think there's a new focus from a value point of view as far as the education is concerned. And it comes from many sources. I mean, not just from NACD, but from Deloitte and others. And I frankly, you know, having been a board member now for over a decade, you get stale if you don't get out there and start stirring with other folks. So I think it's something that you, as senior people that are professionals pushing forward things, are the kinds of things that you can push as well too for boards and what they do. So I think it's important, and I think it needs to be pushed.
And I would just add to that the companies whose boards I've served on have urged the board directors to take courses and to make sure to stay current and to take at least one or two each year. And I have found them very valuable in trying to keep current.
Just to disagree, a little bit a nuance on all that. I thought that the angle at which you asked the question is whether at the point at which you are taking a new board member, whether, quote, NACD certification is looked for. And at least in my experience, the answer is no.
No, I agree with that.
I agree.
Absolutely no.
Right.
That's not to say that there isn't value. That's not to say that a person that has gone through the process has not, you know, gaining confidence and, you know, the way that person will present himself, herself in the process of an interview in terms of knowledge of what's going on. So that's all very valuable. But whether it has a certification value for the new person, for the newbie, I would say, at least in my experience, the answer is no.
I would agree with that.
And I
That's
agree.
not the
So
context of
So I
it.
think
agree
that's
as
the
well.
angle you were coming at in your question.
So we're going to close. I guess I would say I would invite all of us as search advisors, consultants, to really, as Lee Ellis said, lean into the pain of our fears and to do the right thing. It is a business case. 50% of the population, look at this room, we maybe come from different countries, different color, 50% women, 50% men. And I think there's a great pipeline out there, and we need to tap into it and distinguish ourselves as search consultants to change the landscape in the boardroom in an appropriate way where we get to parity. I say by 2022, but anyway, that's my aspiration. I want to thank my panel, the fabulous discussion, and so big round of applause to all of you.